The realization something was wrong struck Benji like a bolt of lightning. The tail end of his chuckling stopped cold as his feet came to a grinding halt on the other side of the door. He heard what must have been the door closing behind him, although it might as well have been a million miles away. The sound of the heavy wood crashing against the frame registered as completely normal. That is, he would agree it sounded normal, had he been focusing on the sound instead of what lay before him. The expected sight of the darkened parking lot, housing the beat-up green Plymouth gifted to him on his 16th birthday, was nowhere to be seen. Instead, the long narrow walls of the diner stretched out in front of him, converging at the far end where the back door sat on its hinges, now quiet and still, nestled snugly within the perimeter of its frame. Benji vocalized weakly. What's happening? Am I going crazy or something? He looked around the diner. Hello? Hello? He asked aloud. His voice bounced muddledly off the walls around him. Is anybody there? He heard himself call out once again, now feeling less like a young man setting off on a return trip down a dark Arizona highway, and more like a baby deer learning to use its legs for the first time. His stomach lurked. Had he dreamed leaving the bathroom, heading down the hall and exiting out the back door? Was he so lost in thought, considering the notion of who might want to live forever and the fallacies of an old age, that he hadn't actually walked down the hall at all? It seemed unlikely, but simultaneously the most plausible explanation. Maybe it's time to cut back on the pot, he thought to himself, thinking he must have punched a hole in his brain or something. Before he could examine the idea more seriously, a flicker caught his eye. Behind the bar, a large flash of light was fading in and out of view. Drawn to it, cautious and unaware of his movement at first, Benji made his approach. The flickering had first seemed like some beam of light, pale and white, perhaps shining through a half-closed set of window blinds. However, no such window existed behind the bar. There was only a service window leading into the kitchen. As he drew nearer, Benji began to realize the light took a familiar shape, about the size and form of a man. The shape retained its dimensions, although the opacity was far less consistent. At any given moment, it seemed to be entirely transparent, only to then deepen in intensity until it appeared to be nearly solid. Either form proved a fleeting state, as the white figure continuously flickered back and forth between being nearly solid and hardly even visible at all. To Benji, it resembled television static, or the old projector devices his grandfather used to show him war clips on as a child. He noticed more of these figures now, placed around the diner, each human-shaped, and all of them flickering between various intensities of visibility. There were 4 in total, though not all of them carried the same dimensions as the flickering figure behind the bar. Benji thought he might have known why, but couldn't bring himself to truly understand just what it was he was witnessing. That didn't stop him from guessing aloud, however. What's wrong with them? He asked the empty diner, thinking aimlessly aloud. It's like looking at a ghost. He was beginning to feel panic rising up into his chest. His first instinct was to turn back to the front door and make a beeline to his car. He couldn't bring himself to turn away, mesmerized by the flickering figures, but he did slowly inch his way back to the door he had just come through, reaching a hand out while still transfixed on the flickering forms around the diner. Benji felt the doorknob against his knuckles. Wrapping his shaky hands around the brass handle, he went to twist it open. To his surprise, the knob refused to turn. It didn't feel locked, more like it had been cemented into position. It didn't jiggle in the slightest, and the door refused to budge. He turned his attention to the door, a dumbstruck look appearing on his face. What? He cried out. What the hell? Why won't it open? I just came through it 2 seconds ago. He continued to tug and twist at the handle, but to no avail. The door was simply not going to open. Benji turned his head back to the flickering figures. His confusion gave way to further panic, which now threatened to consume him entirely. The other door, he thought. Moving quickly down the narrow dining room corridor, he felt his stomach churn. What if it's locked too? He wondered, hoping he wouldn't have to answer that question. As he drew nearer to the door, it seemed to stretch out beyond his reach in an inconceivably long distance. His mind began to race. He likened the short trip down the dining hall to that of a drowning man scrambling toward the surface. It seemed so close, but the desire to reach it as quickly as possible made every passing moment feel like a stone placed on his chest. At last, he did reach the door, and in a burst of relief felt the knob turn under his hand. The familiar sound of the latch giving way as the door swung open was practically music to his ears. What happened next was like a dagger through his heart. Standing in the threshold of the door he had just opened, Benji was confronted with a familiar sight. The narrow interior of the diner stood as it had the first time he had opened the door. Flickering silhouettes in the shape of human figures retained their position, and Benji jumped slightly at the sound of the door closing behind him. His head snapped around. Part of him felt it was pointless, but his irrational impulses overpowered that thought. He dove at the doorknob, and just as he had suspected, it refused to turn. The door itself might as well have been a painting of a door on the wall. As an exit, it was useless to him. Breathing heavily, Benji's hand began to shake. That time, he was hyper-aware. He had not simply imagined leaving the diner. He had made a conscious effort to note his surroundings as he approached and opened the door. Even through his mounting panic and rising confusion, he was certain he had moved through the dining room hall. He was sure it happened. His attention had been mildly distracted by the flickering ghost that sat positioned in the booth nearest to the rear exit. But his focus as he stepped through the door itself was purely on the task at hand. It was at this point his thoughts began to shift back onto them, those ghosts. Just what were they really? Whatever had been going on surely involved them somehow, as their appearance in the diner synced up with his inability to exit. What was the connection? He scanned the diner again, his heart still racing. It was a difficult thing, to feel the panic and confusion that he did, all while trying to make sense of this situation. Unprecedented as it was, there was something about his mind that clung desperately to the smaller details. Survival reflexes, muted as they may have grown in the modern era, had all but disappeared. When the situation calls for it, one may be surprised to find just how adaptable they could become. To Benji, this meant counting the ghosts. 4, he had concluded. 4 ghosts. 4 ghosts. One door that opens, and one that does not. The initial shock of the situation, while still alarming, began to subside. It wasn't much, but he was beginning to piece together something to work with. What it meant, however, was anyone's guess. But it was something, and something was certainly better than nothing. His attention suddenly turned to the windows. Large glass panels overlooking the Arizona desert and an expressway cutting through, stretching perceivably forever in either direction. Benji suddenly felt foolish for feeling so trapped. While bizarre to be certain, surely he was in no way as optionless as he had initially believed himself to be. Weighing just over $1.50 soaking wet, Benji wasn't much of a match for the solid oak doors. But that glass would shatter like a dinner plate dropped from a skyscraper. He just needed something heavy enough to push through it. The bar stools were bolted to the ground, so that it was no good. There wasn't much likelihood in lifting the heavy booth seats either. But again, Benji felt with some certainty it would not take much to shatter the diner windows. Just need something stronger than glass, he thought, looking around the diner. A chair could work. They had strong metal legs and a hardy plastic seat. Worst case scenario, he could try raiding the kitchen for some appliances. A toaster or microwave could probably do the trick. Benji reached for the nearest chair, which turned out to be a wooden high chair the waitress would whip out to accommodate an infant. Benji remembered how often a crying baby would annoy them all when he would be out to eat with his friends. A group of rowdy teens weren't much better, mind you, but Benji would always look down his nose at those rambunctious babies in public places. Now, as he stood with the high chair poised to strike the window, he was thankful for their inclusion in the occasional dining experience. If for no other reason than the use he was sure to make of the high chair in his escape. Benji brought the chair down hard, bracing for the crash. He was slightly stunned when the chair bounced off the surface of the glass with a muttered thud. Undeterred, Benji raised the chair above his head and struck the window a second time. And when he saw he hadn't produced even the slightest crack, proceeded to whip the chair again and again into the pane. Aside from the weak thudding that could be heard as he bashed the high chair into the glass, no evidence that he had even touched the window materialized. The glass remained as unbroken, albeit just as smudged with occasional fingerprints as it had been when he first entered the diner. Unfucking believable, Benji grumbled, dropping the high chair to the floor. Panting from his efforts, he collapsed into the opposite booth and held his head in his hands. I don't understand any of this! He screamed in frustration. He leaned back against the section of wall bordering the booth he collapsed into. His legs stretched out along the seat. Tilting his head back on the window ledge that lined the glass pane over the booth, he let out a long sigh. What a nightmare, he said finally. Yes, a nightmare. Certainly he was dreaming this. He had never been so aware in his dreams before, but surely this was a dream all the same. After all, how would he explain the ridiculous logic in this environment? How was he to encounter a door that was opened one moment and upon its traversal suddenly locked up all on its own? Or furthermore, to have exited the door only to find himself in the exact same room he had just left, via the door that was no longer accessible, no less. Only one thing made any sense, and that was purely that he was dreaming. Worse still, it was one of those Freudian dreams, that kind that carry some implied meaning, the kind where the unconscious mind was trying to tell its host something, the surface effect that had been repressed for one reason or another. It didn't take an expert in dream interpretations to figure this one out. Clearly, the diner represented something along the lines of imprisonment. Something in his life had made him feel trapped, and despite his attempts to overcome this entity, he made no progress, and only succeeded in tiring himself out. Again, maybe smoking pot had something to do with this. Benji sat forward in the booth. He dropped both feet to the ground and stood up, using the table for leverage as he shambled from the booth. Okay, he said aloud. So I'm dreaming. That much seems obvious. So how the hell do I wake up? That was a good question. His attempts to leave the dream through means of the doors were a fail-state, and breaking out through the windows was a no-go too. Benji sighed again and began to shake his head. He stopped suddenly, his eyes lighting up as an idea formed in his head. Wait a minute, he said, as a smile creeped across his face. Maybe I'm looking at this the wrong way. So he was dreaming, this much he knew. But if that were the case, he was bound to wake up eventually. So why not see just what he could do in the meantime to take advantage of the situation. Benji had been hearing a lot about lucid dreaming lately. Apparently, the dreamer could manipulate the events of a dream in any way they wanted. With a sigh, Benji cleared his mind. Well, he thought, step 1 complete. I definitely know this is a dream. Now how about we get something interesting going on in here? He closed his eyes. Standard teenage desires began to flow through his mind. Piles of money, fast cars, cool clothes, and a naked lady avalanche, just to name a few. Benji opened his eyes, craning his neck back, expecting to see the mounds of glorious entities he imagined might be manifested into being. Grey ceiling tiles were the first thing he saw, followed by the familiar surroundings of the diner, completely unchanged. Benji scoffed. Well, that sucks. No riches, no women, and still no way out of this god-forsaken roadside diner. Maybe I'm not dreaming after all. A sudden noise echoed from the bathroom door. It sounded like a child's laughter. Benji jumped at the sound, whipping around to face the door. What was that? He questioned the vacant diner in a panic, eyeing the direction of the bathroom hall. It was quiet now. He inched his way to the door, placing a tentative hand on the knob, and found it pushed open with ease. Okay, he whispered to himself. Clearly the back door to the diner wasn't the only one that still worked. He briefly wondered what old Sigmund Freud would say about this one before pushing his way inside. The teal-colored floor tiles shone vibrantly under the fluorescent light of the bathroom. The wall was also tiled. Tiny 2-inch squares lined the surface area. The wall tiles were light blue, but something was different about them. Something that hadn't been there before. Nearly every inch of the walls had been covered in red streaks. The streaks, which Benji initially interpreted as being drawn in blood, were arranged in jagged groupings. On closer inspection, the streaks resembled classic hash marks, with 4 vertical streaks connected by a diagonal line, starting at the upper left of the grouping and ending on the bottom right. While not drawn in blood, as he initially believed, the presence of the hash marks was an ominous sight, as they populated nearly every surface, with the exception of the ceiling and the fixtures. What in the hell? Benji stood there with his mouth hanging open slightly. Somebody really did a number on this place. He knew there was a pun there somewhere, but Benji couldn't think to define what it was. The marks were dry, seemingly having been made some time ago. The sheer amount of them was a sight in and out of itself. Whomever placed them had done so feverishly, scribbling the marks as a madman would in a desperate frenzy. Their meaning was still unclear, but to Benji, their presence on the wall struck him as another clue, and further closed the possibility of his prior notion that this had all been some kind of dream. With a certainty he could not explain, Benji felt there were connections to be made between the marks that lit up these walls, the static silhouettes in the dining hall, and the one-way passage that looped him again and again. Standing in the bathroom, eyeing the hash marks, Benji struggled to make sense of it all. Before he could wrap his head around any semblance of an answer, he heard the laughter again. This time, somewhat louder than before. It echoed, sounding simultaneously as if all around him and somehow as if coming from the other end of a long echoey tunnel. A loud noise erupted behind Benji. It sounded like a combination of bacon sizzling and the tearing of fabric. He spun around in time to see a strange yellow line stretching down just to the left of him. It seemed to be like a thick golden rope that glowed. The rope unraveled from mid-air, almost eye level with Benji, and dropped to just above floor level. The rope seemed to flatten out and expand, like a puddle spreading on a sidewalk. In seconds, the strange yellow puddle took the shape of a near-perfect oval, rippling from the middle to the rim like a pond that somebody had thrown a rock into. The ripples began to multiply, and before he had time to comprehend what he was seeing, the puddle vomited a human figure from its center. The figure was child-sized and completely golden, just as the puddle had been. Strange 4-inch strings hung off the figure, flexing like tiny octopus arms, wildly in all directions. The yellow figure hit the ground running, narrowly missing Benji as it sped by. The sound of a child's laughter was all around him now, as the glowing yellow child beelined it for the bathroom stall. A second yellow puddle materialized in front of it. Just as the figure collided with this second puddle, a heavy metal clunk was heard as Benji noticed a strange object hit the floor next to the glowing yellow portal. The figure disappeared inside just as quickly as it had arrived, and upon its full encapsulation, the yellow oval constricted into a rope-like form and shrank back to a single point. There was a wet, popping sound, and the point had vanished. The event, in its entirety, had lasted about 5 seconds. Benji stood motionless against the wall by the bathroom mirror, spread out like a bandit hiding in the shadows. What the actual fuck? Benji croaked. He stood like that for half a minute, not knowing how to proceed. The day had gotten weirder and weirder. His attention returned to the strange object on the floor. He had no idea what had just happened. He thought he saw some kind of creepy yellow kid run by him just now. He swore he heard what sounded like laughter. Benji wasn't laughing. Nothing about this was funny anymore, and all he wanted was to get out of this diner as soon as possible. He was about to make for the bathroom exit when the object on the floor suddenly let out a high-pitched whirring sound and began speaking to him.